All right, everybody. Welcome back to our third and final part of events talking about World War One. So today we'll be focusing on the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty that ends the war, and we see what happens to the winners and what happens to the losers. So to begin, let's just go over the quick little checklist here of what we will be focusing on. So why do we want the Treaty of Versailles? What were the punishments that Germany suffered? And what reparations are, and what was the League of Nations. All right, so to begin, Versailles. This is the palace of Louis XIV. It was built, a few hundred years earlier, and it will be the place of the peace talks. Now, this is it today. Here's the Hall of Mirrors, one of the most beautiful rooms in the entire palace. And here it was in 1919 during the peace conference. You have delegates from dozens of nations present, all trying to make a peace that would hopefully last, as well as punish the bad guys. Well, quote unquote, bad guys. Now, why Versailles? Because the French wanted to humiliate Germany the way that they were humiliated after the Franco-Prussian War back in 1871, when the German Kaiser, or the German Emperor, was crowned in the Palace of Versailles. All right, so we need to talk about the big three. They are the leaders of the three big victorious countries of World War I. So to begin, let's see who they are. We have David Lloyd George of Britain, Georges Clemenceau of France, and President Woodrow Wilson from the United States. And they are accompanied in this picture by Vittorio Orlando, who was the leader of Italy. A minor ally, they survived fighting in World War I. That's what we can do. They punched Australia. They got punched back. It was kind of them both just sitting there with a bloody nose at the end. All right. So let's talk about Woodrow Wilson first. All right. He wanted a peace without victory, which means that even the defeated nations are treated well so they won't want revenge later on. That's a very, very good plan, but it's not what's going to happen. So to try and get this peace without victory, he was going to introduce what was called the 14 points, which is basically a bunch of rules that everyone would follow, and no one's feelings are going to be hurt, and no one's going to want any payback or anything. And the Germans actually really liked Wilson because of this, because he didn't want to punish them. Because he wanted to, help them and grow strong bonds between the countries so that we don't have this type of political and military turmoil again in the future. Now, what this is going to also do is get rid of what causes war to happen and hopefully tone down nationalism and imperialism to where it's not such a big problem anymore. Right? End of alliances and reducing military sizes, basically giving fewer means of fighting each other. Right? Self-determination. This is big because basically people are entitled to have their own countries. So like Eastern Europe, we have a breakdown of these big empires that cover lots of ethnic groups. Let the ethnic groups have their own independent nations. So like Croats can live in Croatia. Belarusians can live in Belarus. The Polish people can have their own country. Stuff like that. Right. Also, freedom of the seas and forming the League of Nations. We'll be talking about that in a little bit. But just to cue it in real quick, basically the countries having the goal of settling disputes by negotiation rather than shooting each other. Basically what the United Nations does now. This is the first attempt at that. All right. For France, we have the Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau. Now, he was the exact opposite of Wilson. He wanted to destroy Germany, basically. He wanted to crush them so that they could never threaten France ever again, or any other country for that matter. He thought that Wilson was going too soft on them, and yeah, that there were too many rules in the 14 points, as you can see from that quote there. And now we have British Prime Minister David Lloyd George. This guy, he was somewhere between the two. Pretty much that he knew destroying Germany would not be good for Europe. There would be a power vacuum. It's going to lead to bad things happening. But he also thought that Germany should suffer some sort of punishment for, as they believed, starting the war. Even though if you remember the events that started it, it was actually more like Serbia and Austria-Hungary who started it. They just wanted to file Germany's teeth down so that he wasn't a threat, basically. All right, so how did the punishments happen? Germany, we can basically give it this, brat. Germany had to accept the blame for starting the war and everything that goes along with it. Which means they had to pay reparations, which is the bill for the war, essentially, which their part of it was $33 billion, which if you make that into like today's money equivalent, you're looking at, if not hundreds of billions, it could be into the trillions, that bill. All right. Then they could no longer have an army over the size of 100,000 men. That's basically a defense force like Japan has now. Basically, it's a military police that they could use in case of a national security problem if they're invaded from an outside force, or if there's some type of huge problem where they need to put a city on lockdown or something like that. No more submarines and no more Air Force either. And of course, they lose territory, meaning no more colonies. Alsace-Lorraine, that territory between France and Germany, is returned to France, and they lose land on the eastern side to go to Poland, and their industrial center, the Rhineland, which is a piece of territory in Western Germany that basically goes along the Belgian and French border. That is now to be occupied by Allied troops, and German soldiers are no longer allowed to even set foot there. All right, so Germany before and Austria-Hungary before, and this is what happens afterward. Russia even lost some territories as well because of the Bolshevik Revolution, so new groups were able to solidify their own holdings at the time. All right, the demilitarized zone, that is the Rhineland. It will be occupied for 15 years. All right, Alsace-Lorraine, they lose a little bit of territory. Schleswig, and that goes to Denmark. And then, of course, that big pink area over here, this becomes known as what is called the Polish Corridor. So here's Poland, this big circular one that's next to Germany on its right. That gets the big pink area so that they have access to the sea. All right. Just a little bit more map information. You can kind of see it a little bit better. So if you need to look at it more, feel free to pause. Otherwise, we're going to move on. All right. Austria-Hungary, they are basically no longer an empire. They are broken up, and we get a couple of new countries. We get Poland, so part of them goes to Poland. We get Czechoslovakia, and we get Hungary and Yugoslavia. Serbia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Montenegro, they all become part of Yugoslavia. Austria, they basically lose the entire empire, and they become a small country. And yeah, they got the raw end of the deal. Maybe even a little worse than Germany, because Germany still retained most of its territory, at least in Europe, and Austria, Hungary, they just became a bunch of smaller countries. All right. And Romania actually would gain land while, like, Bulgaria lost land. So, yeah, there's some trade-off there. If you helped out the Allies, you lucked out. All right. This is showing a little bit more of the breakdown. We'll just go ahead and move on. Now, the Ottoman Empire, I did say that they took part on the side of the Central Powers and that they lost. So they are going to be broken up as well. Now, some of the territories became independent, and others, such as Palestine, Iraq, and Syria, they were given to Britain and France to basically manage them until they could become independent in their own rights. And this is what would be called the mandate system, where Allied countries would take over management of colonial territories of the defeated Central Powers until they could take over running themselves for themselves. Now, Russia. Russia is now a communist country, and they were not even invited to Versailles for treaty talks because they were too busy fighting a civil war, honestly. We also did not want the threat of communism being spread into other countries, so we wanted to keep them isolated. All right, so when Russia basically became communist and broke apart and things like that, we get the countries of Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania becoming formed, and they would lose some territory to the now existing Poland and Romania as well. All right, so here's more of a complete map of everything that we get. So take a look at that. It's important to know what happens with maps as a result of World War I. So there's what Russia lost. All right, now the League of Nations. This was really one of the only things that of Wilson's proposal for the 14 points that was carried through with. Very few else was actually taken into consideration, but people did like this. So we would get the forming of the League of Nations, and what they would do is to take cooperative economic and military actions against any aggressive countries. So if a country starts getting a bit uppity, flexing their military muscles and, throwing money into the military and all, maybe we'll start restricting trade to try and limit their funds that they have available for such things. And even though it was President Wilson's idea, the United States, our Congress, who has to vote on being a part of any international organizations or treaties or anything like that, said, no, we don't want to be a part of an international organization because we don't want to get involved with Europe's mess if they ever start shooting each other again. So our president came up with the idea, but we were never a member of it. So, yeah. And because we were not a part of the league actually lost a lot of its potential political strength. Because, hey, they came up with the idea, but they're not even a part of it. It must not be as good as they thought, as everybody thinks it is. Now, there was a lot of anger over the Treaty of Versailles. A lot of nations were very upset and that the goals had not really been achieved. Germany, they got screwed, just to put it bluntly. So they had to pay the bill. They had lost a ton of their military capabilities. They lost a lot of territory. Americans, we thought that Germany was treated too harshly, and that our Congress didn't even accept the Treaty of Versailles because of how strict and harsh it was on Germany. Whereas, we basically knew this was going to come back to bite Europe in the butt. And as I'm sure we all know, it did. All right. Italy, they wanted more land than they were granted from the war. They got just a tiny, tiny little piece of land from Austria-Hungary's empire by the end of the war. And, they helped us win. They kept the Austrians busy. And while the Russians were on the other side, like they did their fair share. Even though, they did not have a great military, they still held their own decent enough that they should have gotten more than just a tiny little speck of land. They should have gotten more. Japan, I know I haven't really talked about Japan, but what you need to know is that there actually was some fighting that Japan did during World War I. It wasn't much, but they did fight against German colonies in the Pacific. So they did help tie up some money and troop movements from the colonies, like to go back to Germany and help out the fatherland. They also were angry because the Allies didn't recognize lands that they had taken over in China at this time. So they're starting to get some bad feelings as well because of the Treaty of Versailles. And I think, as we know, these three countries outside of the U.S. on this page, if you know anything about World War II, we see all three of these countries again, and they're kind of working together against the new allies of World War II. Now, China, they were angry that Japan had been given Germany's sphere of influence. So the economic area that they had control over in China, Japan now has it. We also see Russia being angry that they weren't even invited, and the fact that they lost the territories of Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They wanted to keep it all, but it didn't work out that way, so they got some raw feelings towards the Allies. But, of course, as we know, the war to end all wars actually provided more motivation for us to start killing each other again 20 years later. So that is basically the story of World War I, and you could say the origins of how World War II comes to be. All right. Next time, we'll be talking about the interwar period. So that's going to be like our intro into like the 20s and 30s. All right. So we'll see you when you come back for that. And have a good one, guys.